Hello, everybody. My name is Grace Cook. I am the Project Support Coordinator for the Heartland Health Research Alliance, and I'm here today with our Executive Director, Dr. Charles Benbrook. We're going to talk about the pesticide industry, trends in pesticide uses, and why integrative pest management strategies are so important, right?
Well, thank you, Grace, for that introduction. The Heartland Study scientific protocol was designed by our team of scientists and clinicians to answer a relatively simple question. Is rising herbicide use that's occurring now in the Midwest on corn and soybean farms, is that contributing in any way to an increased frequency in adverse birth outcomes or more severe adverse birth outcomes? We know from past research that pregnant women, the child developing in their womb, and infants and children are much more sensitive and vulnerable to even low dose exposures to pesticides than adults. And so if public health research and pesticide regulatory decisions by the EPA are going to protect developing children and infants and really the next generation of Americans, we have to understand how these low dose exposures are impacting a woman's pregnancy, her ease of delivery, the health of the newborn, and how that infant grows up and progresses through childhood to hopefully a healthy adult with a fully formed immune system that works well when the person is exposed to a bacteria or viruses, and that their nervous system and their brain is functioning normally and supporting the kind of intellectual engagement and behavior that we all hope for in our own families, in our own lives, and as a broader community, and ultimately as a citizen of the world. So one of the reasons that we came together to do the Heartland Study is because of the significant increase in the use of herbicides in the Midwest that started around 2015. Herbicide use had actually gone down in the late 90s and in the first years in the 2000s because of new technology that came onto the market, so-called Roundup Ready seed technology, where corn and soybeans were genetically engineered to allow a broad spectrum herbicide. And by that, I mean a herbicide that controls mostly all weeds, grass weeds, broadleaf weeds. This genetic engineering technology and the changes in the seeds made it possible for farmers to spray Roundup over the top of a growing soybean crop or a growing corn crop, but leaving the crop unharmed because the seeds had been genetically engineered to, in effect, tolerate the glyphosate herbicide that was being applied on them. This change in the way that Roundup herbicide can be used triggered a rapid change in weed management systems across the Midwestern United States. They came on the market in 1996, and by year 2000, only 4 years later, over 90% of the soybeans and close to 90% of the corn was planted to seeds that had this Roundup Ready trait and on which Roundup herbicide was applied. This made weed management, which was a major headache for farmers, a major management challenge and a costly management challenge, it turned it into one of the easiest parts of growing corn and soybeans. It was a very reliable system. It was a very robust system. And the developer, Monsanto, priced the system so that it was competitive with the other alternatives that farmers had to manage the same weeds. So we had, beginning in 1996, and then running throughout the last 20 plus years, this mammoth increase in the use of one herbicide, glyphosate. And what happened was, when farmers rely on any single herbicide for controlling their weeds, it triggers evolution within the weed populations of what's called a phenotype that is less sensitive to the glyphosate than the previous phenotype. And of course, that means that these weeds that are incrementally becoming less sensitive of glyphosate, the odds are that more of those weeds are going to survive and set seed, and then come up the next spring when the farmer plants the next crop. And the reason that glyphosate resistant weeds became such a serious problem in less than a decade is that because farmers in the Midwest, they rotate corn and soybeans. So they grow corn in 2020 and soybeans in 2021. But because the glyphosate resistant gene has been moved into most of the major corn varieties and most of the major soybean varieties, that means that farmers would be applying Roundup in 2020 and in 2021 and in 2022. And this imposes a high level of what's called selection pressure on the weed populations and accelerates the emergence of weed phenotypes that are fully resistant to glyphosate, so that a maximum allowed dose doesn't work anymore. Now, most people have heard about this exact same phenomenon with antibiotics. Any antibiotics that were used for years to treat human infections don't work anymore for common ear infections or urinary tract infections. And the reason is the antibiotics were overused and triggered within the bacterial populations a shift to resistant bacteria that didn't respond to the antibiotics. So this is what it, at the heart of it, is driving increasing herbicide use across the Midwest.
What do farmers have to do then? So there's more weeds, so they have to apply more pesticides, right? Or different pesticides?
Okay, first, Grace, let's clarify something.
Yeah.
Pesticides is a broad term that encompasses all chemicals designed to control any type of pest. Now, the major types of pests that farmers have to deal with are weeds, and herbicides are used to control weeds. Insects, and of course, insecticides are used to control insect pests, and fungicides, which are used to control plant diseases. Those are the three major types of pesticides. So the emergence and spread of herbicide tolerant weeds increased the use of herbicides.
Herbicides, yeah.
And what happens is, as the farmers realize that a number of a particular type of weed that has become resistant in their field, they would spray their Roundup, and there would be some weed escapes that would actually, in the case of soybeans, would grow up and would become taller than the soybeans. And they sort of stand out like a sore thumb when there's a big clump of weeds in a soybean field. And farmers don't like that. It's something that's ingrained in their DNA that good farmers have clean fields. And by clean fields, I mean fields that don't have ugly looking weeds sticking 2 feet above the soybeans, where anybody that drives along the road can see them. So when a farmer starts to see that glyphosate resistant weeds are surviving and growing up in their crops, they have to add a new herbicide into their spray program to specifically target that resistant weed. Now, the herbicide, pesticide seed companies that developed glyphosate tolerant corn and soybeans and sell glyphosate herbicides and sell the other herbicides, they were well aware of this problem. And unfortunately, they did nothing to slow it down or reverse it, which they could have done. And instead, they realized that they had a prime business opportunity by using genetic engineering to move the genes into corn and soybean and cotton plants that make them tolerant of other herbicides. And it just so happened that the two herbicides that really the entire industry decided that they needed to incorporate in their genetically engineered herbicide tolerant corn and soybean and cotton varieties was first an old phenoxy herbicide called dicamba, and more recently another old phenoxy herbicide called 2,4-D. So starting in 2016, when the first dicamba tolerant soybean seeds were sold in the Midwest, we start to see the increase in applications of dicamba on soybeans across the Midwest, because the industry decided, well, we're going to move that gene into most of the soybean seed supply and charge a $12 to $15 premium for the seed. Farmers had no choice. They have to buy seed every year. And most farmers do buy new soybean seed every year. And really all farmers have to buy corn seed every year because it's a hybrid. A farmer can't save the corn harvested from a hybrid seed and plant it the next year. It won't perform like the true hybrid seed.
Right.
So what started happening in 2016 and accelerated in 2017 and accelerated more in 2018 is the use of dicamba herbicides have gone up extremely sharply in the Midwest. In 2016, there was only about 3.5 million acres of soybeans planted to dicamba resistant seeds and sprayed with dicamba. That's out of almost 80 million. So it was 4 or 5% of the soybean crop. But this year, 2021, that dicamba resistant gene is in over 60% of the soybean seed supply. So there's tens of millions of acres throughout the Midwest region that are being sprayed with dicamba now, and sometimes twice, and later in the growing season, because with these genetically engineered seeds, they can be sprayed on the crop 3 weeks after it germinates and starts to grow. And then if there's some additional weeds that escape and come up later, they can make another application in the middle of June or even as late as early July. And what that does is it's spreading out the time period in the spring and early summer when people in the Midwest that live in farm country are being exposed to herbicides, because dicamba and 2,4-D are very volatile. So a farmer can make a legal application of dicamba or 2,4-D on a soybean field, on a cotton field, on a corn field. And when it's hot, and particularly when it's humid, the herbicide on the plants volatilizes. It turns into a gas and it goes up into the air and then moves with the wind. And then where it rains or where there's fog and moisture, the herbicides come back down to earth. And if they happen to land on a sensitive crop, and a significant number of crops are highly sensitive, particularly fruiting vegetables and fruits like tomatoes or cucumbers or melons or grapevines, a wide array of our critical fruits and vegetables that we all need to be healthy are exquisitely sensitive to 2,4-D and dicamba drift. And this has become a huge problem throughout the Midwest. It's a very divisive issue in farm country because many farmers that choose not to buy these seeds and don't use these herbicides, their crops are being damaged by the dicamba and the 2,4-D that's drifting from their neighbors' fields.
So just to clarify, so a farmer with resistant crops can spray it, but it can then travel to a whole different farm and destroy their crops.
Well, usually it doesn't kill the crop, but it sets the crop back. It's like it gives it a serious case of the flu or pneumonia. Okay. And it takes the crop a few weeks to a month to kind of recover, but it never really recovers the full vigor. And so when the farmer goes out to harvest the crop, it'll be short 5 bushels or 8 bushels or 12 bushels of soybeans. So these farmers that aren't contributing to the problem, they're a victim of this characteristic of these two older herbicides. But Grace, while most people in the Midwest, and particularly people in farm country, they're well aware of this problem. It's been covered in their local newspapers. It's part of what's talked about in coffee shops in the morning. It's an incredibly serious and widespread problem, which the founder of one of the independent seed companies in the Midwest recently told NPR is the biggest mistake in agricultural technology he's seen made in his life, and he's in his 80s. Wow. So this has really been a real step backward. Sure, maybe dicamba resistant seeds, 2,4-D resistant seeds make it easier for a few years for farmers to control glyphosate resistant weeds and weeds that are resistant to other pesticides, but other herbicides. But the problem is it's not a technology that's going to last, because this big increase in the use of dicamba and 2,4-D are simply going to lead to selection of weed varieties that are fully resistant to dicamba and fully resistant to 2,4-D, of which there's already some resistant weed species in the Midwest and the southeastern United States.
Could you talk about the herbicide treadmill?
Well, this is sure. I actually have been the herbicide treadmill. It's an analogy that many people use to talk about changes in farming systems and weed management practices that inherently increase the reliance of farmers on more herbicides. It's kind of like once you get on the herbicide treadmill, it only moves faster. There's no way to slow it down. And this is unfortunately been the story on most conventional corn soybean farms in the Midwest starting around 2015. So we're 6 years into the herbicide treadmill, incrementally going into a higher gear, requiring this farmers to apply more herbicides, different active ingredients, apply them more often, and also in some cases, apply them at higher doses, 1 year to the next year to the next year. At some point, Grace, this breaks down because there'll be so many weeds that are resistant to all the herbicides that farmers are applying that they have no remaining herbicide tools to combat the spread of weeds that have become resistant to multiple herbicides in their fields. It's clear to them if they have the problem, because they drive along their field in the middle of July and they see all these weeds popping up above the soybeans or popping up above the corn. So it's not an example of an invisible problem. And in fact, it's highly visible. And of course, they really see it when they get in their combines at the end of the year and they're driving through their fields, harvesting the crop, and they see these big clumps of weeds that are interspersed through the crop that they know robbed bushels of yield. And they also know that it screws up the efficiency of the combine in harvesting the crop and separating the grain from the rest of the crop residue. So this is not a silent problem in farm country. It's very clear. But Grace, what people need to understand is that these herbicides, there are massive quantities being applied on corn, soybeans throughout the Midwest. And after all, these two crops account for 60%, maybe a little more of the surface area of the entire Midwest. So when farmers are spraying 2, 3, 4 herbicides, and some of them twice a year on this vast surface area, those herbicides are going to get into water, they're going to get into food, they're going to be in the air. So people are going to be exposed to them through drinking water, through breathing, and through food, and through clothing and dust and other routes of exposure. And this reality that we know is happening in the Midwest is why we started the Heartland study, because we're concerned that when pregnant women are exposed to rising levels of herbicides during their pregnancy, that they may be reaching an exposure level to certain herbicides that is triggering disruption of how their baby, the fetus in their womb, is evolving, because that is an extraordinarily complicated, sophisticated set of DNA dividing to go from an egg and a sperm, tiny things, to a baby that's got a circulatory system and a brain and eyes and hopefully 5 toes on each foot and 5 fingers on each hand. That is some magical, complex biology that's going on. And it turns out that very low doses of certain chemicals can disrupt some of those critical windows of development. So that's why we started the Heartland study. And at the end of the day, if we do discover that some of these herbicides that are being used more widely in the Midwest are in fact leading to higher levels of exposure in pregnant women, infants, and children, and we're fairly sure that's going to be true. If we also determine and have credible data that shows that the women that are more highly exposed have a greater odds of giving birth to a child that has either a birth defect or some developmental problem, that is incredibly important science to drive changes in how farmers in the Midwest control weeds. Because right now they're on a herbicide treadmill. There's no off ramp. There's no help being provided by anyone that is of sufficient scope and importance to get a widespread transition towards less herbicide dependent systems. So we don't know what our science is going to tell us at the end of the day, but even if we conclude that there at the present time there isn't evidence of significant developmental and birth related problems from these herbicides, there are many other reasons to help farmers begin to cut back on them. Because one thing, they're going to hit a cliff in the next 3, 5, 8 years where there simply won't be any further herbicides that they can apply to control weeds that have become resistant to really most of the herbicides in the toolkit. So as we continue to do our Heartland Study science to understand the birth outcomes, we're also going to be focusing on public policies and private sector policies that will provide incentives and support for farmers that are ready now. And there are many of them in the Midwest that are ready to start backing off the herbicide treadmill. The farmers that are ready to adopt what's called a many little hammer integrated weed management system. So right now, herbicides are the 20-pound sledgehammer, and almost the entire burden of controlling weeds in corn and soybeans in the Midwest is shouldered by herbicides. And that's why farmers use so many of them and are having to continuously use more and more. What university scientists at all the land-grant universities in the Midwest, in Ohio, in Minnesota, in Missouri, in Illinois, in Wisconsin, all of the university scientists are urging their farmers to begin adopting the core practices of what's called integrated weed management. What integrated weed management does is it spreads the burden of controlling weeds out more evenly through 6 or 8 or 10 tactics or practices, as opposed to just depending on one thing, herbicides, to control weeds. That's what's created this serious economic, environmental, and public health problem in the Midwest. And the only way that we're going to reduce the severity of the problem in the future is to support and invest in innovative integrated weed management systems. And this is beginning to happen. And part of what the Heartland Health Research Alliance's policy program is going to focus on is how to integrate these kind of many little hammer approaches to control weeds into the widespread effort in Washington to support what's called climate smart farming. Because as it turns out, the things that farmers need to do to back off of the herbicide treadmill are essentially the same as the things that farmers need to do to capture and store more carbon in the soil, which could be a huge benefit to not just the US, but the global community, by showing a way for farming to not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural operations, which needs to happen and is going on, but also capture more carbon, which really is puts a plus in the overall effort to reduce total greenhouse gases. If we can capture some of that carbon from burning of fossil fuels, from forest fires in the West, if we can recapture that and put it into Midwestern soils, it's going to do a world of good. It's going to help the farmer increase the fertility and the organic matter content in the soil. That helps the soil take in water more quickly and hold more water. Well, why is that important? In a world where clearly global warming is happening, hot temperatures and droughts are going to become more regular in the Midwest. So you want the soil across the Midwest to act like a great big sponge and soak in as much of the rain that falls on the land, on the cropland, and hold it so it can be used later to produce a good crop of corn and a good crop of soybeans. So the improving the quality of the soil and the health of the soil is going to deliver big benefits for farmers, for people that live in rural communities, that people that like to enjoy boating and fishing on rivers and lakes and reservoirs across the Midwest. It's the single change in how farming is conducted in the Midwest that will deliver the greatest variety of benefits across a wide range of really difficult challenges that corn soybean farmers are dealing with. It'll help them with economics. It'll help them with the quality and productivity of their soil. It'll definitely help them deal with these super weeds that are so difficult to control and are costing them more and more every year to control. It'll help with the climate by sequestering and holding much more carbon in the soil. And it may well improve public health among farmers and their families and in rural communities by reducing the risk of cancer, by reducing the risk of reproductive problems like failure to conceive, and assuring that the next generation of Americans born in the Midwest have good cognitive abilities and aren't born with one strike against them because exposures of their mother to low doses of herbicides impaired their development in the womb.
It's really amazing how everything is so connected to the way that we produce food. So, and it's so important. And thank you for sharing your expertise with all of us.